So we're going a little maverick today. 5.1 is technically Tragedy of the Commons, but we've been talking about that all year. So we're going to switch into incorporating land use concepts, which is some stuff from this unit that we isn't necessarily taught explicitly. So we're going to lump it all together, call it one thing: land use concepts. A pretty controversial use of land, hence land use, was the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. It crosses 4 states and it was supposed to move approximately 500,000 barrels of oil per day. One of the big reasons why it was so controversial was that the original pipeline path was shifted from upstream of a majority white community downstream to just above a reservation for the Sioux people, and it was rerouted through some territory that had been given to the Sioux as part of a treaty in 1851. And the company's response to that was basically deal with it. It was pretty rough. The pipeline was originally routed because of worries of contaminating water supplies if there were leaks. So the original route was supposed to go here north of Bismarck, but then it was rerouted to south, which is right where the Sioux Nation reservation was. So that had a lot of people protesting. They were very upset. At its peak, there were about 15,000 people protesting per day. It was quite a big deal. And since then, the pipeline has been built, finished, and turned on, and has leaked several times. So that's fun. All right, Tragedy of the Commons, quick review. This is the overexploitation of a public or common resource by individuals to the detriment of the resource. Eventually, it is so degraded and used up that no one can use it anymore. Your keys here are that it has to be a common resource. It has to be something that is not owned privately. You cannot Tragedy of the Commons your own property. You can be a jerk with it, and you can use it wastefully, but it is not classified as a Tragedy of the Commons. Tragedy of the Commons has to be a public common resource. Like the bathrooms at school, or people at the movie theaters who try to take up an entire row for their friends that will get there soon. Everybody knows they don't have friends. We have this concept of externalities. These are costs or benefits of a good or service that are not included in purchase price. So it's something that you can have to pay for, or something you get without directly paying for it. You're not paying dollars for it. Example there is the smell of bread from a bakery. That is a delicious, amazing smell. Everybody should love it. You're not paying for that. The baker isn't charging or including in the cost of their breads the smell, but it is a nice thing that people gain. And air pollution is a pretty common example of a negative externality. Companies aren't including the price of that environmental damage from the pollution in the cost of whatever product they're making or selling. Smoking is another good example of a negative externality. The cost of the almost inevitable lung cancer medical care that you will need from smoking is not included in the price of a carton of cigarettes. So one of the suggested solutions to curbing these negative externalities is including the price of the negative externality in the cost of a good or service. The example there with smoking would be make cigarettes cost, include the cost of the almost inevitable lung cancer care that you're going to need. A common philosophy among economists looking at Tragedy of the Commons from a money viewpoint is that it requires things to be privatized or regulated by the government in order to stop people from abusing it. But then you have people like Eleanor Ostrom, who she studied farmers in the American Southwest, specifically Southern California, and she found that if you educate people about the resource and the risks involved with overusing it, they will self-manage. They don't need privatization or government oversight in order to take care of their resource. What they need is education and to know their personal stake in it, and then they will act in the collective good. Now, Garrett Hardin is credited with coming up with the idea of tragedy of the commons. He used to appear frequently in College Board assessments. Not so much anymore, since his original application of tragedy of the commons is what you kids call problematic. He was using it in reference to poor people of color, in his mind, outbreeding white people, and how that was a problem. So, terrible man. The core of his idea was pretty good, though. Not the eugenics part, the overuse of common resources. Okay. Evolutionary theory suggests that as a species, humans have to cooperate in order to succeed. And the answer here, why is that possible, is the whole concept of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Two people working together can accomplish a lot more than two people working separately. As a species, humans have come to dominate because of their ability to work together in large scales, large numbers. Okay, the international categories of public lands. For the most part, these categories of public lands also apply the same in the United States, but right now we're looking at an international level. And here we have a breakdown of the percent of land that is categorized as public land. The redder the color, the less land is considered public. It's owned privately. So here in the continental US, very little public land. Where you do have it, it's out here in the west. You have most of your public land here in Alaska. The Amazon rainforest is mostly public land. It's not owned by any one person. Greenland, same thing. This nothing part of Australia where nobody lives and nobody wants, public land. A lot of Europe, where you have more socialist kind of governments and cultures, you have a lot more public land. So the first category, national parks. Almost 3% of the Earth's total surface area, land surface area, my bad, is classified as a national park. These are areas that are specifically managed for scientific, educational, and recreational use. You can go there and go camping. You can go there and do science. You can go there and study stuff, learn stuff, go visit for field trips. Usually, however, there's no economic use. You're not going in to extract resources. You're not going in to try to log trees or mine for ore. Some positives of national parks are you have these fairly large nature preserves where your habitat diversity and your species richness can be preserved. Critters can just be left alone to do critter things. Pretty solid negative, though, are these lands have historically belonged to indigenous people that are displaced. They're told essentially, this may have been your historical home, but get out, we want to look at it, which is big bummer. Okay. Here's an example of the Serengeti National Park in Kenya. So national parks, again, are not a strictly United States thing. They are a worldwide thing. And here we have some cheetahs being cheetahs. Then we had a video from the U.S. National Park System trying to encourage people to visit. It was a little goofy. You can watch it on your own. Managed resource protected areas. What makes these areas different than other public lands is that it does allow the extraction of resources such as minerals or trees. It is supposed to be done sustainably, so the companies that are leasing these excavation rights are supposed to be doing it in a sustainable way, so it's not degrading to the environment, and it is pretty heavily subsidized by the federal government. These companies are paying very little for the right to extract and sell quite a bit of material. In the United States, national forests are a type of managed resource protected area. Companies can go in and log those trees. Here's a managed resource protected area in the Philippines. Here's another one in Cuba. Habitat/species management areas. These areas are unique in that, unlike national parks that are set aside for nature, these areas are actively managed by people in order to keep them healthy. This is where you would put an endangered species in order to keep an eye on it and help it reproduce and regrow those populations that have been lost. So what makes this one special is that it is actively managed. It's not just left alone to do nature things. Humans are going in and intervening. They're putting energy into keeping these areas healthy. Strict nature reserves and wilderness areas. These are areas that are supposed to be almost completely off limits to humans. Scientific research is allowed. Very light recreational activity is allowed. You can go in and look at them, but you're not supposed to touch anything or change anything. The idea there is to set up these conservation areas where nature has been unaffected by humans to just let it do its thing. They're set aside completely so that there's ideally no human interference whatsoever. Protected landscapes and seascapes. This is where you can visit and use the land, but you can't make changes to it. It's a protected landscape. You don't want to change how the land is laid out. You don't want to go in and damage these coral reefs in these seascapes. Snorkeling is an example of using a protected seascape. You can go there, you can snorkel and look at things, but you can't touch the coral or shift the coral or break the coral. Then you have national monuments. These are typically man-made things, but they're considered kind of culturally significant or kind of like the keystone of an area. Iconics, for instance, right there we've got Mount Rushmore. Everybody knows what that is. Here's the Taj Mahal. Here's the Great Pyramids. When you think of Egypt, you're probably thinking of these. They're just things that are iconic to their areas, and there are about 20,000 of them worldwide. And then here are some examples of national monuments. We had specifically large statues. There's a big Buddha. That's a bigger Buddha. And then this is the Statue of Unity in India. In the background, these little guys right there, those are trucks. This thing is really big. And it's almost exactly twice as tall as the Statue of Liberty. If you put the Statue of Liberty right next to this, it would go up to about his fingertips. This thing is big. Now, this is a different representation of the information from a pie chart. So rather than taking a circle and dividing it into pie slices, it's the same kind of concept where you have the continental US representing all of the land in the US, and then it's broken down into percents from there. It does not mean that all the land used for golf is here in South Carolina. It does not mean that the entire Pacific Northwest is privately owned family timberland. What it means is that this percent of the US, if you broke it down into a percent of the total land, is private family timberland in the United States. What you need to see here is that the most prominent use of land in the US is for rangelands, specifically for cows, sheep, goats, and horses. Also here we have a nice little decent-sized chunk of land that's reserved for production of maple syrup, which I think is fun. Okay, U.S. public lands. The United States federal government is the largest single landowner in the country. Nobody owns more land than the U.S. government does collectively. And in the U.S., we have these same categories as internationally, but then we also add rangelands, these big open areas where animals just wander around and do animal things. Here you have the portion of each state that's classified as federal land. The general trend is that as you move west, more and more parts of states are classified as public land, federal land, not private land. And what was happening there was as people were spreading west during the 1800s, the federal government realized that in order to prevent things like timber famines, they needed to step in and manage some of these lands, so they called dibs. And you don't have a lot of that on the East Coast because it's a lot harder to take private land and turn it into public land. And the majority of this federal land is found here in Alaska. Remember that This is not to scale. If this was to scale, Alaska would be about the size of the entire American West. It is very large. You have this resource conservation ethic. It's the idea that nature should be used, but it should be conserved. You're doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's very utilitarian. What's not really explicit here is that greatest good for the greatest number of people may not necessarily mean use it all up now. You're thinking about future people as well. And then people have different ideas or bias when it comes to applying this research conservation ethic. So a big compromise to that was to take these federal lands and classify them as multiple use, so that these lands can be used for multiple different things. You have these large tracts of land that are set aside for the public to use, but then they'll also be a managed resource area where companies can go in and extract trees. You can go in and you can do some hunting. You can go in and go camping or fishing. You can go and visit, ride your bike, go hiking, etc. There's multiple use. Most federal land is classified as multiple use. And then the federal agencies that manage federal land, 95% of federal land is managed by one of these four agencies: the National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the U.S. Department of the Interior Bureau of Land Management.